Hi, I'm Dan from Ozone Cyclery, and in this video I'm going to present to you the detailed technical drawings of the Sven 27.5 Randonneur. In the last video we covered the details of the bike to help you decide whether or not that's actually the bike for you. In this video we're going to help you measure your body to pick the right size of bike and go through the technical drawings page by page so that you understand what each page is for and why it's there. The drawings are in order according to the process of building the bike. That means for each step, which corresponds to one video, it also corresponds to one page of these drawings. So, the first page gives you some basic info about the bike. And this is essentially what we talked about in the introduction. Down here, there's some text, which obviously there's text here. Can't you see it? There's text that basically within one or two sentences describes what the bike is and helps you decide if that is really the bike that you want to build for yourself. The second page gives you information about sizing the bike. Each Ozone design has 5 different sizes that you can choose from, and it's important to pick the one that fits best to your body. So there's different ways that you can go about doing this. The first way is to measure your leg length and compare it to the standover height here. To do that, take a round tube about the diameter of a bamboo tube, for example, a toilet paper roll, and put it between your legs and put it all the way up until it almost gets uncomfortable. So don't leave any space up there. And use a tape measure to measure from the top of that tube down to the floor. And that gives you your leg length. And what you can see is that the standover height that we have listed here is a bit longer. There's a bit of space built in there on purpose so that you can more effectively just compare your leg length to the standover height and make sure that the bike fits you. Essentially, the standover height should be shorter than your leg length. The next way you can do it is to measure a bike that you already have. If you have a road bike that you really like, then you can stand over it and compare your leg length to the bike you already have and whether you find it comfortable. Measure from the ground up to the top tube of the bike you already have and compare that to this standover height. And also measure the effective top tube length. That is from the center of the seat post to the center of the steer tube. The effective top tube length is one of the most important measurements in fitting a bike and frequently goes overlooked. The third strategy that you can use is to measure your height and use an online calculator. There's various ones of these, none of which are sponsoring this video, so you'll just have to pick the one you like the best. But essentially by putting in your height and picking a road bike, for example, it will give you a recommendation for a bike size that you should ride. And that's usually in the form of the seat tube length. I don't actually dimension the seat tube length on this drawing because, to be honest, it's not really relevant, and this is the method that I recommend against. The seat tube length you will find in a later drawing, the one about setting up the frame jig. But let's just say that's kind of like the last resort method that is not my favorite. The fourth most effective and most expensive method of finding the right size is to do a fitting. That means you go to a professional fitter, sometimes a high-end bike shop will offer this service, and they have essentially an exercise bike that you can adjust in every direction. They'll seat you on the bike, they'll take about an hour, adjust things. Some even have like a digital camera and little digital readout things. I'm not really sure how much of that is necessary, but in the end, they will decide for you exactly which size bike you should have, and they're going to use dimensions such as the reach and the stack. Yeah, my favorite and most reliable method for picking the size of the bike is to both measure your leg length and compare it to the standover, and compare the standover and top tube length to bikes that you already have. The next drawing, tube length cut, I also call sometimes the bamboo diameter drawing because it tells you the diameter of the bamboo that you should use. In this drawing, you pick the bamboo that you want to use and cut it to length. The most important dimension in this drawing is this one. It's the diameter of the down tube. As you can see, the diameter of all the tubes slowly decreases from the down tube. Really, these should all be in parentheses because they're not actually critical dimensions. But this one is plus minus 3 millimeters. So you'll use this to pick your bamboo and you'll use it to cut each piece to length. In the tube width sand drawing, what you'll be doing is splitting your bamboo tubes that you picked and sanding them down to a certain dimension. We do this for a number of reasons. The first one is because bamboo has a tendency to split naturally. Bamboo has moisture in it when it's alive, and when you cut it and dry it out, the moisture escapes and the bamboo shrinks a little bit, and that creates tension inside the tube. Sometimes you don't see it, sometimes it's absolutely minimal and doesn't matter, but frequently it leads to the tube splitting. This doesn't mean that it's not a strong tube, it just means that it has a split in it. So to alleviate tension in bamboo that's already there that you might not see, and to revalue tubes that are already split, you can just split them on purpose, sand them down, and glue them back together. And it gives us design freedom to dimension the tubes the way we want. Bikes that have just purely round tubes can also be beautiful, but after you've made a few bikes, it starts to get boring and you start to think, hey, why can't I design this bike kind of the way, say, a carbon fiber frame looks? So that's in fact exactly what we did. We looked at carbon fiber frames and saw how those engineers decided to dimension those frames and mimicked that in the dimensioning of this bamboo. So as you can see, this design calls for a down tube that's not conical. It's 42 wide at the top and the bottom. However, the top tube is slightly conical, so it's thicker at the front and gets a little bit narrower at the back. All of these dimensions should also be taken with a grain of salt. They don't have to be exact, except a couple of them. The seat tube width at the top is critical because the seat tube sleeve has to fit inside. Or let's just say it's only as critical as so long as the seat tube sleeve fits. But down here at the bottom, here it's actually very critical because the width of the tube added together with the offset of the seat tube on the bottom bracket, which you'll see in a later drawing, positions your derailleur hanger. Getting these derailleur hangers to land in exactly the right spot has been the biggest challenge in designing these bikes. And the first step along the way is to sand this tube really exactly to the dimension that it says on the drawing. All the other ones should really have parentheses around them because they're just recommended reading, so to speak. The tube end sand drawing tells you how long your joints are going to be. Your joints are going to have a bit of putty like this, and the composite is going to come to here. Now this is something that we improvised for a long time and never had exact dimensions for, and having exact dimensions for it is beneficial for a number of reasons. Some of them are, for example, that you know from the beginning where your joint is going to land and can use that, for example, to line up the node of a bamboo tube exactly at the end of a joint, which is not necessary, but it sure looks cool. If you come up with some excuse as to why you don't want to sand exactly to the spot that the drawing says, you can always sand it later. It's just easier to do it now when the tubes are loose and just sitting on the table because you can use a belt sanding machine. If you put the bike together and then decide that your joint should be a little bit longer, you can sand it a bit longer by hand. That's no problem. It just takes longer. So this whole step is really just to save time, so you don't have to do it by hand later. The wheel cutout down here is probably the more complex part of this step, and it definitely is worth doing that now, because doing it by hand later is quite a lot of work. As you can see, in this case, I didn't dimension the depth of the wheel cutout, because you should simply go to halfway through the stay. So, in other words, this is two sides of the bamboo that have been glued together right here along this joint, and you can sand one of them completely away. Leave the other side intact. The tube angle cut drawing is fairly self-explanatory. You've got the tubes that are already cut to length, and you've got an angle that you have to cut onto them. You always start with one of the corners here, measure from the corner. This is why it was important to cut your tubes exactly. Measure from the corner, measure the angle, cut it with a Japanese saw. Pretty simple. There's a couple little tricks that you can do. For example, putting a sticker on here with a smiley face on it, because each of these tubes, after you've cut the angle, it's really easy to flip them upside down, confuse which one is which, cut the angle in the wrong direction, whatever. And the smiley face has been a really stupid trick that has saved a lot of effort. Also, the cutouts for the dropouts back here, it's simply take a Japanese saw and you cut a notch out of the bamboo so that the dropout can fit inside. The frame jig setup drawing. This is actually a vestigial drawing left over from using a traditional frame jig. If you're using the ozone frame jig, then you'll want to use the other frame jig drawing. But I leave this frame jig setup drawing in there anyway because it has a lot of really useful information in it. For example, the wheelbase of the bike, information about the fork, and most critically, this bottom bracket offset. This is the seat tube that you sanded to width. You sanded it to a very exact width. And then you set it on the bottom bracket, actually asymmetrically. I promise you, you can barely tell. When the bike is done, nobody notices that it's like this. You set it asymmetrically because that gives the location of your derailleur hanger. And that's quite sensitive. It has to be quite accurate. And if you work carefully and follow the numbers exactly, it will land in the right spot. If you don't, it won't. So these are critical dimensions here. Of course, when people ask about how accurate you have to be with the dimensions of a bike frame, the important accuracy is not actually this drawing. It's, if you can think in 3D, take the bike like this and turn it on its side and look at it from the back. It's if the frame is straight from the back or bent. And that has nothing to do with the dimensions here, it has to do with the frame jig. If you're using the ozone frame jig, then it's important to have a very flat board, a table like this one, with good wood, and you can test it with a level to make sure that it's really straight in every direction. The accuracy of these numbers is actually just the difference between one design and the next design. It might be the difference between one brand of road bike and another brand of road bike. If you end up landing your top tube 5 millimeters longer by accident, hey, some other brand might have done that on purpose. It doesn't really matter. The most critical dimension in this whole bike is the steer tube angle. That actually makes a big difference in how the bike rides. Everything else doesn't really matter. I mean, work exactly anyway. It's worth it. But don't stress out about these numbers too much, because this is really almost the only one that actually makes a difference in terms of how the bike rides. Detailing before composite. This is a complex and rewarding step. This is where you add all the little doohickeys and doodads onto your bike, like water bottle cage mounts and internal cable routing and fender mounts, etc. We do this directly before applying the linen cloth, which becomes the composite joint of the bike. Because, for example, these water bottle cage mount screw attachments come under the cloth. The cloth holds them in place. So this is actually a bunch of little things all combined into one step. And there's just a few little details and tricks that I can show you about this. The first one is get your highlighter markers. And as you do each thing, check it off. Done, done, done. It's really easy to forget one of these by accident. But if you look around your drawing afterwards, and, oh yeah, another water bottle, and you see a number that hasn't been highlighted, it means you forgot something. Another detail is the distance between these screw mounts. I dimensioned them from the bottom bracket. I think I'll change this to add it later, but this dimension is 63 between these two parts. An engineer would say that's obvious because 316 minus 252 is 63, but the average person might measure from the bottom bracket to this one and then to this one and then measure not quite exactly, and then the distance between these two doesn't really fit. Well, it's actually more important that the distance between them is exact than that their location on the tube is exact. Don't improvise on this, because built into the drawing is actually the dimensions of your water bottle and water bottle cage. Look at that, they just fit. So there's a little bit of play there, but it's more important to measure the distance between them accurately than their position accurately. Another little detail about this drawing would be this right here, measuring to the fender mount. This is measuring from the rear axle, and it's a little bit confusing because here it doesn't look like the dropout goes all the way. That's just an artifact of the way I had to cut this drawing. You can see the seat tube is also cut. It's cut something like this and projected like this. So part of the dropout is cut away. That's why you don't see that it goes all the way to the axle. So don't let that bother you. Detailing after varnish. Varnish is actually the last thing that you do, right? So why? What else is there to do? And the answer is cable stops. The cable stops are already varnished as well. Your bike is varnished, they're varnished. All you got to do is basically just screw them in place. So this drawing essentially tells you where to add the cable stops. I ask you please to take these locations a bit with a grain of salt. This is where my development of this process gets a little bit improvised. The fact is, there's a joint here. So this cable stop doesn't necessarily need to be exactly there. It might end up on the joint a little bit at an angle or whatever. So while you're doing this, this will give you a good general location for the cable stops, but also kind of check to make sure that what you're doing is actually going to work. This one down here, for example, you have to make sure that it's really on the bottom, otherwise it can run into the crank. This one right here, this is a tricky measurement because you don't want to accidentally try to put it here, or you'll try to drill into your stainless steel dropout, which doesn't work so well. Some of them really don't matter that much, like for the rear brake, whether it's right here or a little bit lower or higher, it doesn't really matter so long as your cable routing fits. So take what I did here, look at it, consider it, but also consider the components that are going to be mounted, and there might be a couple things on this drawing that you want to change. The location of the derailleur hanger, again, is a very critical thing, and it's hard to get it right, and I'm working on a jig to actually hold that in place according to the bottom bracket, so a jig that's going to slide into the bottom bracket, lock in place, and then really tell you exactly where this thing should go. I'm working on that. We intentionally leave this thing as a screw-on feature because if you put the whole bike together and it turns out it doesn't work quite right, you can screw it off and move it and screw it back down in the place that you want it. So this is one of those things that you might have to adjust at the very end. So I would really like to transition to a direct mount derailleur. This has become standard in full suspension mountain bikes because it's hard to fit it any other place. For our process, it would be easy to make a jig that allows you to use the same screw mounts that we use everywhere else, just to add them here. We did that once and it worked pretty well, but the type of derailleur, road bike derailleurs aren't available in that yet. So I'm hoping that the industry moves in this direction just because it's easier for us to build bikes that way. So there's the technical drawings. In the next video, we're going to select our bamboo and cut it to length.